James D. Pitter didn't just want a driver. He wanted a punching bag with a steering wheel. He tossed a crumpled $100 bill into the gray slush of the curb, watching with a predator's grin as it soaked up the city's filth. "Pick it up, Evans," he sneered, his voice projecting for the board members lingering behind the lobby glass. "Consider it a tip for the silence. You're so quiet, I almost forget you're even there." Before we go further, hit subscribe, because what you're about to discover next isn't what most people expect, and I don't want you missing the part that changes everything. Ashley J. Evans didn't flinch. Standing by the open door of the obsidian black SUV, her posture was as straight as a razor's edge. Her dark eyes didn't drop to the muddy currency. They stayed fixed on James with a clinical, terrifying stillness. She wasn't looking at a boss. She was observing a specimen under a microscope. "Is that all, Mr. Pitter?" she asked. Her voice was a low, melodic hum, devoid of fear and vibrating with an authority he was too arrogant to recognize. James chuckled, stepping into the leather-scented interior. "For now, just drive, and try not to get those cheap shoes on my mats." Ashley closed the door with a soft, final thud. As she walked to the driver's side, her thumb brushed a hidden comms piece tucked behind her ear. "Patience, Doyle," she whispered in seamless, high-dialect Korean, her gaze catching James's eyes in the rearview mirror. "Let him enjoy the view from the top. The fall is always more cinematic that way." The transition from the sidewalk to the driver's seat was seamless. As Ashley pulled the heavy SUV into the chaotic sprawl of Manhattan morning traffic, James settled into the back, already barking orders into his gold-rimmed phone. He didn't look at her. To him, she was merely an extension of the upholstery, a functional tool he had acquired to navigate the city's grit while he stayed pristine. "The merger is happening on my terms, or it's not happening at all," James snapped into his headset, his reflection in the glass twisted into a mask of cold entitlement. He paused, his gaze shifting to the back of Ashley's head. "Evans, why are we stopping? The light is yellow." "A cyclist is about to swerve, sir," she replied, her voice as steady as a heartbeat. Before the words had fully left her mouth, a bike messenger lunged into their lane, missing the front bumper by less than an inch. James lurched forward, his phone slipping from his hand. He recovered with a snarl, his ego bruised more than his body. "You should have seen that coming sooner," he grumbled, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of confusion. She hadn't braked hard. She had slowed with a predictive grace that felt unnatural. "I hired you to get me to the office, not to play guardian angel to the locals." Ashley didn't respond. Her hands stayed at 10 and 2, her grip light but absolute. She wove the 6,000-pound vehicle through the gridlock with a surgical precision that would have made a professional racer sweat. When a delivery truck suddenly reversed into their path, she didn't gasp or jerk the wheel. She performed a controlled slide into a gap no wider than the SUV itself, clearing the obstacle with a millimeter to spare. James watched her in the rearview mirror, searching for a tremor in her hands or a bead of sweat on her temple. There was nothing. Her expression was a void, a terrifying, unreadable calm that made the luxury cabin feel suddenly small. "You're surprisingly good at this for someone who looks like they've never been outside a library," James remarked, trying to reclaim the power dynamic with a jab. "Where'd you learn to drive like a getaway driver, or did you just spend a lot of time running from the law back home?" He waited for the flash of anger, the defensive stutter, the sign that he had touched a nerve. Instead, Ashley simply caught his eye in the mirror. For a split second, James felt a chill crawl up his spine, as if he were the one being hunted. "I've spent a lot of time observing how people react under pressure, Mr. Pitter," she said softly. "It's a very revealing metric." James let out a forced, sharp laugh. "Is that so? Well, observe this. You're 5 minutes behind. If I'm late, it's coming out of your first check." Ashley nodded once, her gaze returning to the road. Deep in the encrypted layers of her earpiece, a soft chime signaled an incoming transmission from Seoul, but she ignored it. She had all the information she needed for the morning. James D. Pitter was exactly the man the dossiers said he was, loud, fragile, and utterly blind to the shadow currently guiding his path. The glass-walled conference room on the 64th floor overlooked a city James Pitter intended to own. As the board members settled into their Italian leather chairs, James gestured toward the door where Ashley stood, motionless and vigilant. He hadn't called her in to assist. He had called her in to serve as an exhibit. "Gentlemen, meet the new help," James announced, his voice booming with a performative joviality that didn't reach his eyes. He leaned back, swirling a glass of amber scotch despite the morning hour. "Picked her up from the bargain bin of some local agency. She's quiet, I'll give her that, probably because she's never seen a room this expensive before. Isn't that right, Evans?" A ripple of uncomfortable laughter drifted through the room. Ashley's expression didn't change. She remained a shadow against the mahogany doorframe, her eyes tracking the movement of every man in the room with the calculated precision of a predator counting its prey. She wasn't looking at their suits. She was looking at the sweat on their brows and the tremors in their hands. "Look at her," James continued, his tone sharpening into a serrated edge. "She's got that look like she's waiting for a bus in the rain. I bet she thinks merger is something you do on the highway." He turned to the CFO, a man named Henderson. "I'm paying her 3 times what she's worth just to see if she can handle the smell of success without fainting." As James launched into a tirade about profit margins and hostile takeovers, a rhythmic vibration pulsed against Ashley's wrist, the haptic signal of a Tier 1 priority alert. Behind her ear, the microscopic bone conduction earpiece crackled to life. A voice, low and urgent, spoke in a dialect of Korean so formal it was reserved for the highest echelons of the Seoul underworld. "The shipping manifests in Busan have been seized. They are looking for the director's signature." James was mid-laugh, mocking the supposed poverty of Ashley's neighborhood to a sycophantic associate, when he turned away to grab a document. In that heartbeat of diverted attention, Ashley's lips barely moved. The sound that emerged was a razor-sharp whisper, a command delivered in flawless, aristocratic Korean that hummed with absolute authority. "Freeze the accounts and incinerate the digital paper trail. I will handle the director personally." She went back to stone before James turned back around. He caught only the tail end of her silence, misinterpreting it as the shame of the defeated. He smirked, tapping his ring against the glass table. "See, not a word," James gloated, pointing a finger at her. "Total submission. That's what happens when you show them who really holds the leash." Ashley met his gaze. For the first time, a ghost of a smile touched the corner of her mouth, not of subservience, but of a dark, private irony. James Pitter thought he was the master of the room, unaware that the woman he was mocking had just authorized the erasure of a multi-million-dollar problem with a single breath. The board meeting had left James in a foul, agitated mood. The silence of the SUV's cabin, which should have been a sanctuary, now felt like an indictment. He stared at the back of Ashley's head, frustrated that his insults had slid off her like rain on glass. He needed to see her break. He needed to see the mask crack and the unassuming girl from the agency scream. "Change of plans, Evans," James barked, leaning forward to tap roughly on the partition. "Forget the penthouse. Take the industrial loop through the Hollows. I've got a meeting in the warehouse district." The Hollows was a labyrinth of crumbling brick and narrow, dead-end alleys where even the police moved in pairs. It was a place designed to swallow people whole. As they crossed the rusted bridge into the heart of the district, the atmosphere shifted. Groups of men in hooded jackets looked up from the shadows, their eyes tracking the glint of the luxury vehicle like sharks scenting blood. "A bit nervous, Evans," James taunted, his voice laced with a cruel anticipation. "These aren't exactly the manicured lawns of your dreams. One wrong turn and we're stripped to the frame in 10 minutes. As if on cue, a battered sedan swung out from a side street, intentionally blocking their path, while 2 motorcycles sped up from behind, flanking the SUV. James felt a surge of genuine fear, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the door handle. But when he looked at the rearview mirror, he didn't see panic. He saw a cold, mathematical focus. Ashley didn't brake. She didn't hesitate. With a flick of the wrist, she downshifted, the engine roaring in a way James hadn't known it could. She didn't avoid the sedan. She drove toward it until the very last microsecond, then executed a precision pit maneuver that sent the lighter car spinning harmlessly into a pile of trash. The motorcycles closed in, one rider reaching for the SUV's door. Ashley shifted her weight, her eyes scanning the geometry of the narrow street. She tapped the brakes, causing the lead bike to overshoot, then accelerated into a J-turn that defies physics for a vehicle of that size. She navigated the maze of the hollows with tactical fluidity, using the terrain as a weapon, threading the needle between rusted dumpsters and concrete pillars at speeds that should have been impossible. When they finally burst back onto the main thoroughfare, the attackers were miles behind, and the SUV was without a single scratch. James sat back, his heart hammering against his ribs, his breath shallow. He looked at Ashley, expecting to see her gasping or trembling. She was adjusting her cuffs, her breathing as steady as a monk's. "You're a lunatic," James hissed, his fear curdling back into a bitter, defensive anger. He couldn't admit he had been saved. To do so would be to acknowledge her competence. "You nearly trashed a $400,000 car. I hired a driver, not a stuntman. If you ever drive like a common criminal again, I'll have your license revoked before you can hit the curb." Ashley steered the car toward the light of the Upper East Side, her expression unchanged. "The objective was to reach the destination safely, Mr. Pitter," she said softly. "The car is intact. You are intact. The rest is just noise." James turned away, staring out the window, his annoyance burning hotter. He had tried to scare her, but he was the only one whose hands were still shaking. The interior of the SUV had become a mobile war room, though James D. Pitter was losing the battle. For 3 days, his empire had been bleeding from 1,000 microscopic cuts. A major shipping conglomerate in Singapore had abruptly severed ties. A crucial zoning permit for his Hudson Yards project was lost in a bureaucratic labyrinth, and now the lead investor for his tech acquisition had stopped returning his calls. "It's a coordinated strike. It has to be," James roared, slamming his tablet against the leather seat. He looked like a man unraveling, his expensive silk tie loosened and his eyes bloodshot. "Someone is inside my network. Someone is choking my cash flow." In the front seat, Ashley navigated the midtown crawl with her customary, maddening serenity. To James, her silence was no longer just a trait, it was a provocation. He leaned forward, his face inches from the partition. "Do you find this amusing, Evans? The quiet life of a driver must be so simple. You don't have the capacity to understand what it's like to have the world on your shoulders." He sneered, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "While I'm losing millions, you're just sitting there, staring at the taillights. You're a biological GPS, nothing more. Maybe if you'd spent less time being mysterious and more time getting an education, you wouldn't be a spectator to greatness." Ashley didn't blink. Her left hand remained steady on the wheel, while her right hand rested near a concealed interface built into the center console. As James descended into another telephonic tirade, screaming at his COO, Ashley's fingers danced across a haptic touchpad. A series of encrypted commands bypassed James's personal firewall. With a single tap, she authorized the short selling of Pitter Holdings' primary stock in the Tokyo Exchange. With another, she diverted a fleet of his cargo ships to a port controlled entirely by the Hay Syndicate. James was so blinded by his own reflection in the vanity of his rage that he didn't notice the soft, blue glow of the hidden screen reflecting in the curve of her sunglasses. "I'm talking to you," James snapped, kicking the back of her seat. "Say something. Tell me you understand how insignificant your paycheck is compared to the disaster I'm dealing with." Ashley caught his eyes in the mirror. The specimen was reacting exactly as the data predicted. Under pressure, he turned on the nearest available target. He was a man who confused volume with power. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Pitter," she said, her voice a cool balm over his scorching temper. "It must be terrifying to realize that everything you built is held together by threads you can't even see." James scoffed, turning back to his phone. "Threads, I built a fortress, girl, this is just a glitch." Ashley looked back to the road, a ghost of a shadow passing over her face. She had already pulled the final thread. The fortress wasn't just under attack, It was being dismantled brick by brick from the driver's seat of its own flagship. The limestone facade of the Metropolitan Museum glowed under a brutal autumn downpour, a stark contrast to the red carpet where the city's elite vanished into a world of silk and champagne. James D. Pitter didn't step out of the SUV. He practically lunged, his umbrella held high by a trembling valet. He didn't look back as he issued his command. "Stay with the vehicle, Evans. Don't move until I call. And don't you dare use the heater. I'm not paying to idle the engine while you nap." Ashley sat in the dark cabin, watching the rain hammer against the reinforced glass. For 40 minutes, she remained perfectly still, a shadow within a shadow. The temperature dropped, and the windows began to fog, but she didn't shiver. She simply watched the security detail at the entrance, her mind cataloging their rotations and the slight delay in their comms chatter. The silence was broken by the frantic ringing of James's secondary phone, left behind in the leather seat pocket. A moment later, a text flashed, speech on the seat. "Get IT to me now." Ashley stepped out into the deluge. Within seconds, her black blazer was heavy with water, and her hair was plastered to her forehead. She didn't run. She walked with a measured, rhythmic pace through the stinging rain, the folder shielded beneath her coat. When she entered the gilded ballroom, the music didn't stop, but the air shifted. The guests, draped in diamonds and designer tuxedos, turned to stare at the soaked woman standing near the marble pillars. James was mid-anecdote with a group of venture capitalists when he spotted her. He didn't look relieved. He looked delighted by the opportunity. "Good God, Evans, look at you," he barked, his voice cutting through the hum of the string quartet. He walked over, gesturing broadly to her dripping clothes. "I asked for my speech, not a drowned rat. I hope you didn't get the leather wet on your way out. Honestly, can none of you people handle a little weather without looking like a tragedy?" A few guests looked away, the cruelty of the display curdling the atmosphere. James snatched the folder from her hand, deliberately letting his fingers brush the damp fabric of her shoulder with a sneer of disgust. "Go stand by the service entrance. You're ruining the aesthetic of the room." Ashley didn't retreat. She moved to the edge of the ballroom, standing motionless against a velvet curtain. From her vantage point, she wasn't a victim. She was a surveyor. Her gaze swept over the room, settling on a high-ranking city official and then a rival CEO, her eyes cold and analytical. She wasn't seeing the wealth, she was seeing the vulnerabilities. A waiter hovered near her, offering a napkin with a look of genuine pity. Ashley didn't take it. She merely looked at him, and for a second the man recoiled, struck by the sudden, inexplicable feeling that he was the one being watched by someone far more powerful than anyone in a tuxedo. James was center stage, basking in his own noise, entirely unaware that the ghost in the corner was currently deciding which of his guests would still be standing by morning. The sky over the Pitter Tower was a bruised, heavy gray, reflecting the chaos currently tearing through James's balance sheets. His phone hadn't stopped vibrating with liquidation alerts and frantic legal queries, but as he stepped out onto the bustling plaza of the city square, he didn't look at the screen. He looked at Ashley. He needed a victory, even a hollow one, and she was the only thing left he thought he could still control. "Stop," James barked, standing in the center of the midday rush. He ignored the commuters swerving around them and the tourists pausing to watch the spectacle. He turned to Ashley. His face flushed with a desperate, manic energy. "Don't bother getting back in the car, Evans. In fact, don't even touch the handle. You're done." Ashley stood perfectly still, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. The wind whipped her damp hair across her face, but her eyes remained fixed on his with that same unsettling, clinical depth. "I'm firing you," James shouted, his voice cracking with the strain of his ego. He stepped closer, stabbing a finger toward her chest. "And I'm doing it because you're a failure. You're a ghost, a nothing, a charity case I picked up out of some gutter. You thought you could sit in my presence and absorb my light? You're a parasite, Evans. A slow, silent, incompetent parasite." A crowd began to form, sensing the blood in the water. James fed on the attention, his gestures becoming more theatrical. "Look at her. She can't even defend herself. That's why you'll never be more than a servant. You lack the spine for greatness. I'm blacklisting you from every agency from here to Seoul. You won't find work scrubbing toilets in this city by the time I'm finished. You're erased. Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of." He waited for it. He waited for the tears, the plea for mercy, the sudden collapse of her stoic armor. Instead, Ashley simply tilted her head. The corner of her mouth quirked, not in a smile, but in the way a judge might look at a defendant who has just talked themselves into a life sentence. "Is that all, Mr. Pitter?" she asked. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, cutting through the city noise like a silk cord. "It's more than enough for a nobody like you," James spat, turning his back to her to play to the crowd. "Get out of my sight. You're a stain on the sidewalk." He began to walk toward the revolving glass doors of his headquarters, his chest puffed out in a mock display of triumph. He didn't see the 3 jet black SUVs suddenly mounting the curb at the far end of the square. He didn't hear the synchronized thud of 12 heavy doors opening at once. He only felt the sudden, freezing shift in the air as the crowd went silent, not because of his tantrum, but because of what was standing behind him. The screech of tires against the pavement was a violent, metallic scream that silenced the crowd. 3 identical black SUVs, their windows opaque and menacing, swerved across the busy lanes to mount the curb, forming a physical wall between James and the rest of the world. The traffic behind them ground to a halt as if the city itself had held its breath. James froze, his hand halfway to the revolving door. He turned, his anger momentarily replaced by a sharp, instinctive spike of adrenaline. He watched as the doors of the lead vehicle swung open in perfect unison. A phalanx of men in razor-sharp charcoal suits stepped out, their faces unreadable, their eyes scanning the plaza with military efficiency. Then, the rear door of the center vehicle opened. Hay Doyle stepped onto the concrete. He was a man of quiet, terrifying elegance, dressed in a tailored coat that cost more than James's car. To the world of global finance, he was a myth. To the underworld, he was a god. James had spent 3 years and millions of dollars in lobbying fees just to get a 5-minute audience with the man, only to be rebuffed at every turn. James felt a surge of manic relief. This is it, he thought, his ego instantly refilling the hollow space in his chest. He's seen the news. He's here to bail me out. He's here for a partnership. Ignoring the shivering remains of his dignity, James wiped his face and plastered on his most predatory billionaire smile. He stepped toward the convoy, extending a hand as if he were the master of the plaza. "Mr. Hay, what a coincidence," James called out, his voice cracking slightly with a mix of desperation and triumph. He glanced back at Ashley, wanting her to see the kind of men who sought his company. "I assume you heard about the transition at Pitter Holdings. I was just clearing some." Dead weight. Perfect timing for us to discuss that Singapore merger. Doyle didn't stop. He didn't even blink in James's direction. He walked with a steady, purposeful stride, his eyes fixed on a point directly behind James. The billionaire's hand remained hanging in the air, a pathetic, unreciprocated gesture that the crowd began to whisper about. "Mr. Hay," James stammered, his smile faltering as the powerful man brushed past him as if he were a ghost, or worse, a minor inconvenience. James turned, confused, his eyes following Doyle. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The feared boss of the Hay Syndicate wasn't heading for the tower. He wasn't heading for a meeting. He stopped 3 feet in front of Ashley J. Evans, the woman James had just called a stain on the sidewalk. The air in the square turned freezing as Doyle, a man who bowed to no one, lowered his head in a gesture of profound, unwavering respect. The silence that descended upon the plaza was not merely a lack of noise. It was a physical weight, heavy and suffocating. James stood paralyzed, his extended hand still hovering in the empty air, a useless appendage belonging to a man who no longer understood the world around him. He watched, eyes bulging as Hay Doyle, the ghost of the global markets, the iron fist of the East, stopped before Ashley. Doyle didn't just stop. He inclined his body in a slow, deliberate bow that originated from the waist, a gesture of such profound deference that it seemed to pull the oxygen out of the square. Behind him, the 12 men in charcoal suits followed suit in a synchronized wave of black cloth. "The board has been waiting, Director Evans," Doyle said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that carried across the hushed crowd. He spoke in English now, but with an inflection that treated the language like a secondary tool. The purification of the Western assets is complete. We were concerned that the environment here had become too tedious for your tastes. James's face didn't just pale, it turned a sickly, translucent gray. The word director echoed in his skull like a death knell. He looked at Ashley, the woman he had mocked for her cheap shoes, the driver he had forced to stand in the rain, the nobody he had just blacklisted. She hadn't moved a muscle, yet she seemed to have grown 10 feet tall. The rain-slicked blazer that he had called a rag now looked like a general's uniform. "It was necessary, Doyle," Ashley said. The voice that emerged from her was no longer the melodic hum of a servant. It was a cold, crystalline command, a voice that sounded like it had been forged in the boardrooms of empires and tempered in the shadows of the underworld. She didn't look at the crowd, and she certainly didn't look at James. She looked through him, as if he were a pane of glass that had finally shattered. "A specimen is best observed in its natural habitat," she continued, her gaze finally drifting to James. The clinical stillness he had found so annoying was now a terrifying promise of retribution. "Mr. Pitter was kind enough to show me exactly how he treats those he deems beneath him. It was a very enlightening month." James tried to speak, but his throat had turned to sand. "Director, Ashley, there's been a misunderstanding. A joke. We were just—" "Be silent, James," she said softly. The command wasn't shouted, but it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his expensive leather heels slipping on the wet pavement. He looked at Doyle, hopping for a shred of the professional courtesy he thought he was owed, but the Korean boss was looking at Ashley with an expression of singular, terrifying loyalty. James realized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated horror that he hadn't been hearing a driver. He had been entertaining a goddess of the abyss, and he had just spent 30 days spitting in her face. James tried to move toward her, his mouth working in a silent, frantic plea, but the men in the charcoal suits shifted, a subtle, collective tightening of the perimeter that froze him in place. Ashley didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The plaza had become a cathedral of her making, and James was the sacrifice. "You spent 30 days trying to break a driver, James," she said, her voice carrying a terrifying, rhythmic precision. "While you were busy tossing hundreds into the mud, I was busy reallocating your offshore holdings. That glitch in Tokyo, that was me. The lost permits in Hudson Yards, my signature on the denial. Every time you kicked the back of my seat, I pulled another brick from your foundation." She took a single step closer, her presence so immense that James actually recoiled, nearly tripping over his own discarded briefcase. "By the time the markets open tomorrow, Pitter Holdings will be a ghost story," she continued, her tone conversational, almost bored. "I've leaked the recordings of your tests in the hollows to the ethics committee, and the footage of your performance at the gala is already trending on every major network. You aren't just bankrupt, James. You are radioactive. Not even the debt collectors will want to be seen standing near you." James looked around the crowd, desperation clawing at his throat. He saw the phones held high, recording his ruin. He saw his peers, men who had laughed at his jokes an hour ago, turning their backs and disappearing into the gray city mist. He was a king who had just realized his throne was made of paper, and Ashley had just lit the match. "You can't do this," he whispered, his voice a pathetic, broken reed. I have standing, I have a name." "You had a name," Ashley corrected him, her eyes flashing with a final, cold finality. "Now you just have a history, and it's a very short one." She turned away, dismissing him as effortlessly as one might discard a used napkin. Doyle stepped forward, opening the door of the lead SUV with a silent, reverent click. Ashley paused at the threshold, the rain finally beginning to taper off, leaving her silhouette sharp and lethal against the city lights. "I'll leave the SUV, James," she said, looking back over her shoulder one last time. "You'll need something to sleep in tonight. I doubt anyone will be opening their doors for you." She stepped into the vehicle, and the door closed with a heavy, pressurized thud that sounded like the lid of a coffin. In perfect, silent synchronicity, the 3 black SUVs pulled away from the curb, weaving into the Manhattan traffic with the same surgical grace Ashley had displayed on her first day. James D. Pitter stood alone in the center of the square, surrounded by the silence of 1,000 eyes. He reached for his phone, but the screen was dark. His service had already been cut. He looked down at the muddy $100 bill still lying in the slush by the curb. It was the only thing he had left. The city didn't stop for James D. Pitter, and as the red taillights of the convoy vanished into the Manhattan twilight, the silence that remained was the loudest sound he had ever heard. He stood on the damp pavement, a man who had spent his life measuring worth in decimal points, finally realizing that he had miscalculated the only currency that mattered, the human element. Ashley had not used a single bullet or a physical blow to ruin him. She had simply allowed his own character to act as the architect of his destruction. In the high-stakes world of global influence, she had demonstrated the ultimate masterclass in psychological leverage. Power, as James now saw through the stinging clarity of his failure, was not found in the ability to shout the loudest or humiliate the most vulnerable. True power was the quiet, disciplined capacity to observe, to wait, and to understand the landscape before making a move. As he looked at his reflection in the darkened glass of his own tower, he saw the face of a man who had mistaken a temporary title for an intrinsic right. He had treated leadership as a license for cruelty, forgetting the fundamental law of the social contract. That authority is only as strong as the respect of those who uphold it. By dehumanizing his driver, he had blinded himself to the very person holding his life and his secrets in her hands. He had prioritized the ego of the moment over the strategy of the decade. The educational value of his ruin was etched into the cold wind of the plaza. It was a lesson in emotional intelligence and strategic patience. Ashley's victory was a reminder that in any power dynamic, the person with the most self-control is the one who truly dictates the outcome. While James was a slave to his impulses, Ashley was a master of her objective. She had turned his arrogance into a blind spot, proving that when you underestimate someone based on their position, you give them the perfect vantage point to dismantle you. James reached down, his fingers trembling, and picked up the mud-stained $100 bill. It was a hollow artifact of a life built on the wrong foundations. He watched the commuters rush past him, none of them pausing to offer help or even a glance. He was a non-entity, a cautionary tale in a bespoke suit. The world moves on, but it remembers the character of those it leaves behind. Ashley J. Evans had walked away not just with her dignity, but with the entire board, leaving James to finally learn, in the crushing weight of the shadows, that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one you assume is only there to open the door. You just saw what happens when power hides in plain sight, but this is only the beginning. What other secrets are waiting behind closed doors? What happens when the truth comes out, too late to stop it? If you love stories where the powerful get humbled and hidden identities shake everything, hit subscribe now. The next story will make this one look tame.